She was 41 years old, and she had exactly $11.40 to her name when the men from the bank came and set her trunk down in the mud outside the house she had lived in for 19 years. Her name would come in a moment, but first, understand this. The man who cast her out was not a stranger. He was her late husband's own brother, a cold and calculating man named Thaddeus Blaine, who held a note on the property and had waited, patient as a spider, for the widow's grief to soften her into an easy target. She had $11.40, a mule named Solomon, and a trunk of her husband's tools. And with that she walked 3 miles into the town of Cutter's Hollow and paid $10 for a collapsed, rusted-out icehouse on the edge of the frozen creek, a building so forgotten that even the auctioneer laughed as he took her money. It was, by every measure the town could see, the purchase of a desperate and foolish woman. But beneath the black ice that had not been cut in a decade, sealed in that icehouse floor, something was waiting that would not only change the rest of her life, but would answer a question that had haunted Cutter's Hollow for 11 long years. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Odessa Marsh. If you are watching this from a place feels forgotten tonight, a place other people have written off, we want you to know we see you, and we invite you to tell us about it in the comments below. Odessa Marsh had been born Odessa Cray in the spring of 1858 in a low cabin at the edge of the Kansas timberline, the third daughter of a man everyone in 3 counties called simply the Iceman. Her father, Higgins Cray, was not a wealthy man, nor an educated one, but he possessed a trade that in those days was as vital and as reverent as any preacher's calling. He cut ice. Every winter, when the creek froze thick and blue-black, Higgins would take his daughters out onto that ice before the sun rose, and he would teach them to read it the way other men read scripture. He taught Odessa to listen for particular groan ice makes when it is thick enough to bear a horse, and the different, sharper crack that means a man ought to run for the bank. He taught her to saw in long, patient strokes, to float the great blocks down the channel he cut, to haul them up with tongs and horsepower onto the sledges, and then, most sacred of all, to pack them away in sawdust and straw inside the ice house, layer upon layer, so that the coldness of January might survive all the way through the blistering heat of a Kansas August. Ice's patience made solid, her father used to tell her, his breath fogging in the dark morning air. Anybody can see the worth of a diamond. It takes a particular kind of eye to see the worth of a thing that looks like nothing at all, sitting quiet, waiting for its season. Odessa did not understand, as a girl of 9 or 10, how deeply those words would come to define her entire life, but she held on to them anyway, the way a child holds on to any phrase spoken with love and repeated often. Her father died when she was 17, of a fever that came on during an unusually warm winter, when the ice had come in thin and treacherous, and there had been talk, even then, of the Cray family's ice business struggling, of debts owed to men in town who were only too glad to see a poor family stumble. It was in the year following her father's death that she met Elias Marsh, a quiet, broad-shouldered carpenter's apprentice who had wandered through Cutter's Hollow looking for work, and who had, of all things, fallen in love with her while watching her repair a cracked ice tong handle with more skill than most men twice her age possessed. Elias was gentle in the particular way that strong men often are, careful with his hands and careful with his words. And he had a brother, Thaddeus, 3 years a senior, who was neither of those things. Where Elias built, Thaddeus calculated. Where Elias gave a fair price and slept easily, Thaddeus squeezed every transaction for its final cent, and slept, it seemed, not all, but simply lay awake counting. The 2 brothers had inherited a modest carpentry business from their own father, and though Elias did the finer work, it was Thaddeus who kept the books, who held the paper, who understood. Long before Elias ever did, that paper and signatures could be more dangerous than any axe or saw. Odessa married Elias in the autumn of 1878, in a small ceremony held in the yard of the very ice house her father had once run, which by then had passed, through circumstances of debt she did not fully understand as a young bride, into Thaddeus Marsh's name. It did not trouble her overly much at the time. Elias assured her that family looked after family, and for many years that seemed true enough. Elias built her a home a mile outside of town, a sturdy clapboard house with a porch he made wide enough for 2 rocking chairs. For when we're old and gray and still arguing about supper, he used to say, and Odessa, who had lost her mother young and her father not long after, poured every ounce of the love she had into that marriage, into the modest, steady life they built together. She learned to keep accounts, to barter fairly, to can vegetables and cure meat and stretch a dollar until it groaned, all skills that would matter enormously in the years to come, though she did not know that yet. They were never wealthy, but they were, for 15 years, deeply and quietly happy, and that, Odessa often reflected, is its own kind of fortune that no man can repossess. The fall began, as so many falls do, with a single winter that would not end kindly. In January of 1893, when Odessa was 35, a contracting job took Elias 2 counties north to help raise a barn frame for a farmer named Duell, and a sudden ice storm caught him on the road home. He was found 2 days later beneath a fallen elm, and Odessa buried her husband in ground so frozen the grave diggers had to build a fire over the plot first to soften the earth enough to dig. The grief alone might have been survivable. In time, the way grief usually survived, slowly and imperfectly. What made it unsurvivable was Thaddeus. It emerged, in the weeks after the funeral, that Elias had co-signed a loan years earlier to help his brother purchase new milling equipment, a piece of paper Odessa had never seen. Tucked away in a ledger Thaddeus produced only after Elias was safely in the ground and unable to dispute a single word of it. Thaddeus claimed, with a face of practiced sorrow, that the debt had never been properly settled, that the house Elias built with his own 2 hands had. Through a tangle of liens and cross-signatures, Odessa could not follow and could not afford a lawyer to untangle, become collateral for his brother's failing mill business. For 6 years, Odessa fought in the only ways available to a widow with no money and no standing. She wrote letters. She pleaded with the circuit judge. She sold her mother's silver and her father's remaining ice tools, one by one, to pay lawyers who took her money and accomplished nothing. And in the spring of 1899, on a gray Tuesday that smelled of thawing mud, the bank's men came, at Thaddeus's quiet urging, and set her trunk down in the yard, and Odessa Marsh, 41 years old and utterly alone, watched the home her husband built recede behind her as she walked into town with $11.40 and a mule. She did not walk toward the church, though the reverend would have taken her in. She did not walk toward her one remaining cousin 2 towns over, though pride was only part of the reason. She walked, instead, toward the old Cray family Icehouse at the edge of the creek, the building her father had built with his own hands before she was even born, which Thaddeus had acquired in the same tangle of debts that had claimed everything else the Cray and Marsh families had ever touched, and which he had, in his greed, entirely neglected for the better part of a decade because ice cutting was slow, unglamorous work that did not interest a man who preferred to make his money on paper. The ice house stood half-collapsed, its cedar-shake roof caved in on the north side, its double walls of sawdust insulation rotted through in patches, sitting on a frozen bend of the same creek her father had cut ice from for 30 years. When the town auctioneer, a portly, kind-eyed man named Mr. Pruitt, mentioned almost as an afterthought that the county was finally selling off the derelict structure to recoup a few dollars of back taxes, Odessa stepped forward before she had even fully decided to, and offered every cent she had beyond what she needed for bread. $10. The small crowd gathered for the tax auction actually laughed a soft, pitying laugh at the widow buying the one piece of ruin nobody else wanted, and Pruitt himself tried gently to talk her out of it, telling her she could surely find better use for $10 than a heap of rotten timber and 15-year-old ice. But something in her father's old voice, dead now for 24 years, was speaking louder in her memory than any living man's counsel. It takes a particular kind of eye to see the word of thing that looks like nothing at all. She spent her first night in the ice house wrapped in a horse blanket, listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the north wall, and in the gray light of the following dawn, hungry and cold and near despair, she began, out of nothing more than a lifetime's habit of not letting good material go to waste, to clear away the collapsed section of roof, so that at least the rain would not pool where she meant to sleep. It was while dragging away a fallen roof beam that she noticed something odd about the floor, beneath the deepest layer of old sawdust in the northeast corner, the coldest, most sheltered part of the house where her father had always packed the ice meant to last longest into summer. The floor there did not sit flush the way it did everywhere else. There was the faintest seam, nearly invisible beneath years of frozen sawdust and grime, running in a perfect square roughly 4 feet across, and when she knelt and pressed her weight upon it, one corner gave, ever so slightly, with a small hollow sound entirely different from the solid earth surrounding it. Her heart began to beat with an urgency she had not felt since the day the bank men came, and she spent the better part of that first cold morning clearing sawdust away with her bare, chapped hands until she uncovered the edges of what was unmistakably a trapdoor, its iron hinges rusted and nearly solid, built directly into the Icehouse floor and covered for who knew how many winters beneath the frozen blocks her father used to store there. It took her the better part of an hour, working the hinges with grease she rendered from the last of her bacon fat, before the door groaned open onto a narrow set of hand-hewn steps leading down into a space beneath the Icehouse floor that was impossibly dry and cold and undisturbed, walled in fieldstone, clearly built with great care and greater secrecy. And there, in that hidden chamber beneath where the ice itself had always rested, she found the first clue, a small iron strongbox, its lock long rusted, sitting alone on a stone shelf and resting atop it, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept the damp at bay for what she would soon learn was more than a decade, a leather journal bearing on its cover, in her own father's unmistakable hand. 3 initials that stopped her breath entirely. EM for Elias Marsh. Her hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped the journal twice before she managed to open it. And what she found inside was not, as she first feared and hoped, some late correspondence from her husband, but something far stranger and far older. The journal had indeed been kept in this hidden cellar for some 10 years, but the handwriting inside, once she steadied herself enough to read it by the gray light filtering down through the open trapdoor, was not her husband's at all, but her own father's, Higgins Cray, dated an entry stretching across the final 2 winters of his life, the very winters when talk had swirled through Cutter's Hollow of the Cray-Ice business, failing and falling into debt. What the journal revealed, in her father's plain, careful hand, was that the Cray Icehouse had never truly been failing at all. Higgins Cray had discovered, cutting ice one bitter January in the deep bend of the creek, where current ran slowest, a vein of what the journal called heavy stone, bright as a coin, thick in the gravel bed beneath the ice itself. Higgins, a practical and unshowy man who had spent his whole life valuing patience over spectacle, had not run into town shouting about gold. Instead, understanding better than most that a poor man discovered suddenly rich invites nothing but trouble, thieves, and false friends, he had spent that final winter quietly and carefully diverting a portion of the creek's gravel bed, panning what he could in secret during the long nights while the ice sat curing, converting what he found into coin and small ingots through a discreet assayer 2 counties away, and hiding the proceeds, along with a hand-drawn map of the veins' precise location beneath the frozen creek bed, in the very strong box now sitting before his daughter. He had intended, the journal made painfully clear in its final entries, to reveal the find slowly, responsibly, in a way that might benefit not just his own family, but the whole struggling town of Cutter's Hollow, which had suffered through years of poor harvests and a played-out lead mine that had once been its only real industry. He had written of building a proper cooperative claim, one that would employ half the town rather than enrich one greedy man. And he had written, with evident and growing unease in his final entries, of a business associate he had begun, cautiously, to confide in about the discovery, a man he referred to only as T, who had begun asking pointed questions about the Icehouse's finances that Higgins found increasingly troubling. The journal ended abruptly in the deep cold of that final February, the same month Higgins Cray took ill with a fever that would kill him within weeks, and Odessa understood, sitting in that hidden stone chamber with frozen tears on her face, their father had likely died before he ever had the chance to safely reveal what he had found, or protect him from a very man his instincts had already begun to warn him about. The strongbox itself, once she forced its rusted lock with a chisel from her husband's old tool trunk, contained not a fortune in raw gold, for her father had been too careful and too slow a man to accumulate one in a single winter, but something arguably more valuable to a woman standing at the absolute bottom of her circumstances, nearly $400 in coin and small assayed ingots, a sum that could have comfortably purchased back her house twice over, and beneath the coin, folded in, oilcloth of its own, the hand-drawn map itself, marking with careful, precise notation the exact bend of the creek and the depth of gravel, where a vein of gold-bearing stone continued to run, unclaimed and untouched, directly beneath the frozen water not 40 yards from where she now knelt. For 3 days Odessa told no one, moving to the cold, half-ruined Icehouse in the days of grief and disbelief, rereading her father's journal until she had nearly memorized its final entries, piecing together at last the shape of betrayal that reached back further than she had ever imagined. The man her father had referred to only as T, The business associate whose questions had troubled him in his final healthy winter could be no one but Thaddeus Marsh, who even then, more than a decade before he schemed his own brother's widow out of her home, had been circling the Cray family's modest ice business, sniffing out whatever profit he could extract from people too trusting or too busy with honest work to suspect him. Odessa understood now, with a clarity that made her physically ill, that discoverer. Though the county's own investigators, drawn by the public scrutiny of the case, began quietly uncovering enough irregularities in his old loan and lien filings that his carpentry and mill business would, within 2 years, collapse under the weight of its own long-buried dishonesty without her lifting a single finger against him. Instead, she did what her father's journal had always intended. She organized, with Reverend Combs' help and Mr. Pruitt's practical guidance, a cooperative mining claim on the gravel bed beneath the creek, offering shares not for purchase but for labor, so that families across Cutter's Hollow who had struggled through the same lean years, she could work the claim and take home an honest portion of what it yielded. She rebuilt the Icehouse properly, restoring it not merely as a monument to her father's memory, but as a functioning business once more, employing 3 young men from town who had no other prospects, and she used a portion of the gold to establish a small relief fund, administered through the church, for any widow or family in the county who found themselves suddenly and unfairly dispossessed, precisely as she had been. Within a year, Cutter's Hollow, which had spent a decade in slow economic decline since its lead mine played out, found itself transformed by the modest, steady flow of gold coming up from beneath the creek, transformed not into a reckless boomtown, but into something sturdier, a place with new roofs, a repaired schoolhouse, a mercantile that no longer had to extend credit it could not afford, all quietly seated by a woman the town had once laughed at for paying $10 desperate for a pile of rotten timber. The Icehouse itself became something of a local landmark, and it was not uncommon in the years that followed for townsfolk to bring their own children to see the spot, to hear the story of the widow who had bought the one thing nobody wanted and found beneath it the means to lift up an entire community rather than merely herself. And so we return to where we began, a woman of 41, standing in the mud with $11.40. Watching her home disappear behind her, walking instead to her collapsed ice house that everyone else in Cutter's Hollow had long since written off as worthless. It would have been easy and understandable for Odessa Marsh to have let that moment define her as a victim, a woman ruined by a greedy man's schemes. Instead, she let it define her as her father had always hoped she would, as someone with particular kind of eye it takes to see worth in a thing that looks, to everyone else, like nothing at all. The gold beneath that ice floor was never really the treasure of the story. The true inheritance Higgins Cray left his daughter was patience, and the quiet, stubborn faith that value does not announce itself loudly, that it waits cold and still and unassuming, for someone willing to kneel down in the frozen sawdust and look closely enough to find it. Thank you so much for spending this time with Odessa's story tonight. If it moved you, we would be so grateful if you would share it with someone who might need a reminder that what looks forgotten is not always worthless. And we would love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? We read every single one of your stories, and they mean more to us than you know. Until next time, stay close.